But finally, at long last, an American journalist goes and has a conversation with Donald Trump about what the plans are. And we find out he's going to deploy the military, but he's for that. He's locking up political opponents and prisoners, and the list goes on. But
are you going to get locked up, Steve?
It's incredible to be asked the question, right? It's incredible to be asked the question. I'll tell you this. Well, it's incredible to be asked the question. It's incredible to be, to consider the question, but you can't be intimidated by it, right? At all. This is The Warning, and I'm Steve Schmidt. Recently, I was pleased to be able to spend an hour talking with my friend, Mathew Littman, who's a senior advisor to Brady United against gun violence, as well as being a senior advisor to the Biden-Harris campaign. Mathew lives in LA. He's deeply connected in the entertainment community. He's a great speechwriter, and he's a person who you want to have around the table in any political debate or discussion because he has a wise temperament and he understands that politics is not imposing, it's persuading. So Mathew Littman and I talked about a lot of things going on in the country, and I'm pleased to share that conversation with all of you. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Good to see you as always.
One of the things we've talked about guns that I've said to you is the complete illiteracy of your average Democrat in Congress about guns. And this is a problem, right? Because this is an urgent issue. People who own guns, like all people everywhere on earth who know something about something, don't want to listen to people who they know nothing about it. And so much of politics, as you know, takes place in this space between the lines. And so there's a story in the news about Kristi Noem, the puppy killing governor of South Dakota. And the story comes out, and it's so much worse than you think it is. So what Kristi Noem admitted to doing in the book is taking this puppy to the gravel pit, aiming a 12-gauge shotgun at it that has a very substantial kick, and blowing it away.
I'm going to hold on to this picture during our. I'm not going to shoot this time.
And if you pointed a 12-gauge shotgun at anything at point blank range, you'd obliterate it. It would be a grotesque result. This is important to be able to understand, I think, not to sensationalize, but to explain, for instance, contextually, why a cavitating AR-15 round is so much more deadly than a bullet fired from a 30-06 hunting rifle at a deer. And why it is that these military weapons ought to be placed on a registry of banned firearms that are illegal under federal law and have been for 90 years under the Machine Gun Act or the Federal Firearms Act of 1934, which bans, for example, the .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, as well as sawed-off shotguns, which is why Kristi Noem wasn't able to point that shotgun at that dog like a handgun. She had to aim it like a long gun. As somebody who's at the front of guns, how do you overcome the illiteracy problem, the cultural divide, an urban party trying to talk to rural voters who are constantly lied to, deceived, and demagogued about that common sense protection is necessary in a society that's gone off the rails, and we can achieve it without destroying the Second Amendment?
So it's a fair question, and not a short one, by the way, Steve. That's a fair question.
No.
But the answer is this. First thing is you have to admit what you don't know. You have to say, I don't know everything about guns. What I do, like for example, for me personally, is I know how to bring people together on an issue. So I know, for example, that I've gone to shooting ranges. I'm not a gun owner, but I've gone to shooting ranges. I know something, but I also know where the American people are. Right. And I know how gun owners feel based on surveys that have been done that I've been a part of as well about how gun owners feel. So I'm capable of walking into, for example, a Republican office or a Democratic office and saying, here's where the people are. Here's where your constituents are. This is what they believe. Now, the disconnect very often doesn't come from the fact that I'm not a gun owner. It comes from the fact that people who are often in my position, not always, but often, will say to anybody who disagrees with them, well, you're bought and sold by the NRA. That's not true, right? So for example, what I push back, that's condescending, right? And so I would say to people, do you think that if every town wanted to put the money into a candidate, it would be less than what they would get from the NRA? I mean, it's not the money. It's that people actually disagree with you. And it's okay to disagree, but you have to explain why your position is right and try to move people to your position. A vast majority of people in America are in favor of red flag laws, background checks, including gun owners, right? We don't have them as much as we would like. Universal background checks are getting closer. Not quite there yet, but you have to be able to explain it to people. Steve, it's true on the gun issue. It's true on a lot of issues, which is that everybody who disagrees with you is not bought and sold. Some people just disagree. And the idea of actually having a conversation and an argument and moving somebody to your point of view seems gone because everybody else will tell you, and I know you experience this all the time, is, well, if you don't agree with me, you're corrupt.
I mean, I think that's a profound point. So, I'm just sitting here processing what you said. And when did that go off the rails in the country? In that there's a total incapacity to have any level of conversation. And so how do you break out of this?
Right. So I think part of it is, for culture has some responsibility for it. I remember seeing a movie, you may have seen it, with Jessica Chastain a few years ago. She was a lobbyist, but of course it was this giant corruption thing involving the lobbyist. What if you ask somebody, Steve, about a lobbyist on an issue, they will automatically think that that person is corrupt. Not the idea that the person may be representing a nonprofit or whatever it might be, and is really, a lobbyist is another term for advocate. But that whole term has become basically a four-letter word without people understanding what it is. So the whole idea is that everything is bought and paid for by big companies. You go on any issue at all, and when somebody disagrees with you, it's the idea, go online, I know you've seen this stuff, that, well, if you disagree with me, well, of course you're paid for by the, you're following the big media, you're paid for by this, that. That's not really the way the world works. So I think part of it, though, is when we talk to people, as you do, you have to be humble and you have to explain to them, I don't know everything about the issue. I know, for example, I have data, right? And you're a data, you know more than anybody about everything pretty much. Steve, if you were making up half the things that you said, like, I know you know everything about history, I wouldn't know. I'd just be like nodding my head and be like, okay, sure. Because you know so much more, but you have to be humble when you go in. So I work on very difficult issues. And the one thing is, even now, I don't know how this whole thing is going to play out, for example, on the protests, right, at college campuses. And you keep seeing stuff about outside agitators coming in at the college protests, comes from one side. But that might not be the case, right? It may be that these college students are really angry and they're protesting, and it's not outside agitators doing it. Like the January 6th thing, if you were a MAGA person, you would say Antifa came in and they antagonized everybody. It's like two sides of the same coin. It's this idea that your side is so pure and the other side has to be corrupted. And I think a lot of it has to do with when we talk to people, we can't be so definitive in our points of view. You have to listen. I'm a Democrat. Democrats have gotten stuff wrong for decades. Everything that we did in the 1990s seems wrong today. It's okay to say, here's what I think. I might be wrong, but here's what I think. Do you want me to give you the worst example?
Yes.
Okay, so when Rudy Giuliani, because anytime you use Rudy Giuliani as an example, it's bad. But when he was the mayor of New York in the 1990s, when he came in, the city was absolutely falling apart, right?
Yeah.
Giuliani and Bratton came in. Everyone told us the city was done. It was never coming back. It was the post-David Dinkins era. And they turned that city around. And how did
Yes,
they
they
do?
did.
Yes, they did. And they did it by caring more, it seemed, than you did, than I did, than anybody did. And Rudy Giuliani would show up when somebody was shoplifting. He would show up everywhere because he wanted to get it right. And his ideas may not have always been good, right? Bratton's ideas, and he's the best police chief in the country, he might not have always been right, but they tried. You would see those videos of Bill Clinton up at 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd be trying, he'd be thinking about what he could do. He didn't always get it right, and it's okay to get things a little bit wrong. The effort is what's important here, that we try to get things right. And a lot of that is gone.
I want to stay on guns for a second and about that conversation. As you know, I spend a lot of time in Canada, in Toronto, blended family, second marriage, 5 kids, and I'm a gun owner. I own a lot of firearms. When I come to Canada, and this was most vivid to me walking on a trail at Niagara Falls, where there's a parallel trail on the other side, on the American side. And it's the exact same thing, just on the different opposite sides of the gorge. And it was crowded. It was hot. It was the summer, tourist trap, both sides. People have different kind of pressure points. I'm in a big crowd in a summer day. And I felt relief that I'm in Canada, not because there's no chance of there being a mass shooting. It could happen anywhere in the world. But the chances of someone popping out of a bush with an AR-15 or three is so much dramatically less. And so I share something with Barack Obama. He's older than I am, but I had a kid who was a first grader when Newtown happened. And the president said that was the worst day of his presidency. And I'm somebody who thinks that that day was probably the most jarring day of my life psychologically, of disbelief that had happened in my life. So that to me is the starting place, is my anxiety point as a parent. I think about it all the time. I know that I'm not alone on this, right? Anybody who drops a kid off at school, right? There are kids who will get off summer break, who will not survive the next school year, who will be killed in their classrooms. We know this. So to me, that's the starting place. That's the starting point. How do we mitigate that, right?
Yeah, but you're talking specifically, Steve, about people. It depends what you want to do, right? So, for example, if you favor red flag laws, 2/3 of gun owners favor red flag laws. So, the loudest voices are the ones that get heard, right? So, in other words, if I go on TV to talk about guns, they're going to have both sides on TV to talk about guns very often, right? So, but why? Because background checks is something that 90% of the country agrees with, right? When I was at a previous organization called 97%, somebody would say, which was based on a poll that showed 97% believe in background checks, somebody would say to me, well, I saw a poll that says it's 90%. Okay, you win. It's 90%, right? That's the most popular legislation in the United States. But those people get heard very often. They're very loud on Twitter. So I would say that there are not that many people that disagree. There are members of Congress, this is the way the system works, that don't agree. They get a vote. And if you are not able to get those people in that you want in those races, in those candidacies, then you may not win. If you have the filibuster in the Senate, and let's say right now, 55% of the Senate, 55 senators favor background checks, you may not get to the number that you need to because of the filibuster, right? Even though the majority of senators favor background checks. Supreme Court, which is going way backward on gun issues. If you vote for a president that favors what the NRA favors, then that's what you might get from the Supreme Court. You have to vote. You have to do. And part of this, Steve, is people want easy answers. Like when the abortion rights decision came down last year, or was it the year before already? People were furious and they wanted it overturned the next day. Well, it took 50 years to get it overturned, to get Roe versus Wade overturned. Right? It's not going to happen tomorrow that we're going back the other way. But people want you to do it. They want it now. Figure it out now. That's not the way this works. We have over 400 million guns in this country. There are 45,000 deaths in a year with a gun. That situation does not get turned around tomorrow. There is a lot of hard work that has to go into it. And as you know, because you've worked in politics for a long time, it goes slowly, slowly, slowly. You push, you push, you push. Then there's a breakthrough. Right? And that's what you have to work on. It happened on civil rights. It happens on many issues. This is one of those issues. And that's why we're doing this program called Show Gun Safety, because we can't do everything on gun issues, but this is something we could do.
It is incredible to think about how little coverage approaches the issue from the frame of, wait a second, you got 90% of the country agrees on this, and yet can't pass it.
Right.
Why is that?
Because you have these legislators who are in certain states who don't want gun reform passed. They don't believe in it.
Has the NRA as a target? They are a malign, malevolent organization, but are they destroyed? Is that an organization?
Right.
Is that an organization breathing?
Right. So not that much, but it doesn't matter to an extent. And why I say that, Steve, is because with all of the blame on the NRA for what's gone on, and they deserve some of the blame, certainly for changing the conversation about guns over the last few decades, no question about it. They've changed the conversation about guns. But what people, if you say to people, well, the NRA really isn't doing much right now, so why isn't there the legislation that you want? Well, then people don't know. And the answer is because it's how people feel. So in other words, there's a group called the Gun Owners of America, which is another lobbying group, which is almost to the right of the NRA. There's the National Shooting Sports Federation, which is almost to the right of the NRA. They're super effective at lobbying on Capitol Hill. They're great at this stuff, right? Or wherever it is that they lobby in the states or talking about these issues. They're very, very effective organizations. The NRA can go away. These organizations, if you talk to a congressional office about what they hear on gun issues, they'll say, man, we got 400 calls from the Gun Owners of America yesterday. And believe it or not, that matters to these congressional offices. They're very effective. So the NRA is not as effective, certainly, as it was. And if it isn't, it may not matter.
Let me ask you a question about what we're seeing on the college campuses. And politically, there's an issue that I think Democrats are on they're just enormously on the wrong side of, and it's the student loan repayment issue. And I remember during this last election cycle being with my friend Tim Ryan, Democratic congressman from the Mahoning Valley, running for the U.S. Senate, and we're on these little towns on the Ohio River, bankrupt, hollowed out, opioid epidemic, and I go, how much is the repayment plan? He goes $300 billion. $300 billion in American money. I'm watching the campuses, and it's not changing my mind about wanting to repay the kiddies' debt. We are within the living lifespan of the Holocaust. What are we seeing? They're calling her Kafia Karen at Columbia, who wanted the meals brought in, right, by the university. And the reporter says, now you're a revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I want to understand the meal plan, right? So there is an absurdity to it. There is an enormous number of them out there who have no idea why they're there, what's happening, utterly ignorant, having the cameras in on them. What are we watching?
I've worked on this issue also for a long time, Steve. And, for decades, the left of the Democratic Party has gone toward the, let's say, pro-Palestinian side with no pushback at all. But that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that they've just gone that way. And, Israel has done the worst for decades, not after October 7th, for decades, the worst job of promoting itself and what it is. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and they just didn't do it. And then there are lots of great organizations in the United States that work on the Israel issue or anti-Semitism or whatever it might be, but they also did not do an effective enough job, no question about it, of talking to the left. And though before October 7th, the question was, would the center left leave Israel, which I don't think has happened yet. But I think part of the problem is that we let this group go. Now, liberals, by their nature, and I'm fairly liberal, believe in the underdog, right? That's the thing. We're fighting for the underdog. And Gaza is perceived as the underdog, right? So Israel, this tiny little state surrounded by over 20 Arab countries, is perceived as the big bully. And Gaza and the Arab states are now perceived as the underdog, right? And so no, there's just never been pushback on this issue. I've been hearing about these groups. I almost didn't believe it when I would hear about it, 7 or 8 years ago, about the anti-Semitism stuff on campus. I really was sort of dismissive of it. It was just too hard for me to believe. But now, obviously, the stuff that we're seeing, the things that people feel free to say. I went into New York the other day, and I get off the plane, and there's a guy holding up a sign that says Zionism is terrorism. I mean, what is it's shocking to me, Stephen. I can't tell you that I have an answer as to what to do about the college campus thing. I do not. I can say to you that it's very important that the center left holds. And so far, the center left has still been pro-Israel. They may not like everything that's going on in Gaza. I don't think anybody really loves it. No one likes Netanyahu. That's another thing that's really destroyed Israel's reputation, just like Trump does for the United States. Netanyahu is really, if you had a good leader in Israel who could speak to the world, that would have made a big difference. But you don't. Netanyahu doesn't have that credibility. And in some ways, obviously, you've seen in the United States, he's chosen Trump's side. He's chosen the Republican Party side. That's a very unusual thing for an Israeli prime minister to do. When you go to these unprecedented, when you go to these congressional hearings, right? So we watched the dean of Harvard, the crap kicked out of her at a congressional hearing. I'm not saying she deserves it or she doesn't deserve it, but if you're on the left,
she deserved it.
But if you're on the left, though, Steve, and you see the right wing congresswoman from New York attacking this dean from Harvard, that's not going to convince you to side with the right wing congresswoman from New York, right? And so I think that gets the backup of these progressive groups and these students. But I think we let this thing go way too far for decades. And I think all of us are to blame for it, including legislators, including lots of my friends at these organizations. They let this stuff go for decades and did not push back enough.
We've arrived at this moment where we have a generation of young people sieging the nation's most elite universities. And so when you talk about like Harvard, right, Elise Stefanik and the president are both products of Harvard. Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley. When I think of the Sam Bankman-Frieds, and I look at these colleges, so you're not seeing it like the University of Iowa and Missouri, right? Like what's going on at America's elite colleges? And I just say this as someone with college-age kids. Yeah. Proud dad of a University of Iowa student. They have some of it there, but so hard to get into these colleges. So like what's the metric that we're using that evaluates these people as our best and our brightest? Like this is it. And the moral repugnancy, and you said I'm pro-Palestinian.
Yeah.
I believe that there should be a Palestinian state that's decent and people can have a life, but the Gaza territory's been sovereign under command of Hamas for 20 years. They built tunnels and bought weapons. And one day they came and killed more Jews than on any other day since the Holocaust. And it seems to me that's what's being celebrated and cheered for. And there's a moral repugnancy to that has to be confronted. When I look at this, I think the answer to it for a lot of Americans is Trump. So I say, thank God it's May and it's the end of the school year. So there can be a plan for September, but with the Democratic National Convention between the end of the school year and the beginning of the school year in Chicago, Well, are you worried about this?
So I definitely think that the optics of commencement speeches this year, for example, which are coming, right? The Democratic Convention in Chicago, which has a history that we all know about. Sure, I am worried about it. And I'll tell you, it's very interesting, Steve, because you're a political guy, right? So everybody talks about the youth vote, the youth vote, the youth vote. And I want to say, first of all, I want the youth. I love the fact that young people are engaged. They may not be engaged in the way that I would like them to be. I'd love to be able to move that passion into a way to be more supportive, or really, because I don't think that they're helping their cause, right? You say you're pro-Palestinian, as am I. I absolutely want there to be a Palestinian state. I'd love if there was some government that could have a state and use their money on their people instead of building tunnels and buying weapons. That would be great. Have a state. By the way, somebody asked me yesterday, has Israel been occupying Gaza for the last few decades? And I said, Israel got out of Gaza a long time ago. Like, people don't even know that basic stuff. But am I worried about it? Sure. So this is what I sometimes say to people, because everyone tells me I'm planning a concert to get young people out to vote. I'm planning this to get young people out to vote. People over 50 are going to vote for Joe Biden. Try to find a way to get those people to the polls to support Joe Biden. Everybody's got a concert idea. I've heard enough concert ideas. I want young people to vote, but also they vote less, right? So instead of this blind focus on young people, young people, young people, young people, I know it may not be as cool, but get some buses to that senior citizens home and get those people out. They vote. Focus on getting those people to vote. A little less focus. I mean, this is sacrilege, I know, on young people voting, and a little more focus on the people that vote. And if you support Joe Biden, those people are supporting Joe Biden. So let's get them out to vote. Young people, I can't tell you, Steve, it may be that there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And it may be that Israel comes to an agreement with Saudi Arabia, which is part of what started the October 7th thing in the first place. And it may be that somebody, an Arab group, takes over in Gaza and helps move that thing forward, all by November. That's very possible. I don't know. You don't know. We don't know the answer to that yet. And in that case, things might die down a little bit if that's what happens. There may be protests or whatever, but that very well might happen. That is my hope. I mean, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, can't be doing more diplomacy in these countries and making a bigger effort. He himself has said Hamas needs to accept a ceasefire. If that ceasefire is accepted and then we're able to move on in some way, that would be very helpful.
I'm thinking of a very specific John Kennedy speech, which is his last major address at Amherst University, celebrating Robert Frost, the role of the artist in a society. And he begins by talking about that the university, the College of Amherst is of the United States, as Robert Frost was of the United States. And what is the purpose of a great institution of higher learning, but for a great national purpose? There's been a huge amount of exaggeration in the recent years by MAGA, by this grievance fueled fascist movement. And one of the whipping boys has been this concept of wokeism, which I've been dismissive of, but the presence of a very radical ideology on these campuses, skewed towards the elite campuses, is self-evident in this moment. I don't think it particularly matters that there's an explosion of radicalism on an American college campus at any particular moment in time. We've had them before, except for one thing, and that is the anti-Semitism in the context of Israel losing this war. And I think that's not talked enough about. When we talk about Netanyahu, This is the worst prime minister in the history of Israel, a profoundly incompetent man, an amoral man, the gravest intelligence disaster in the history of the state of Israel, complete unpreparedness, complete incompetency on the response, complete incompetency with the war fighting strategy, complete incompetency with the causus belli and its justness, complete incompetency with the execution of the campaign in Gaza, which in the end has turned world opinion against Israel,
Right.
has left 6 combat battalions alive in Gaza,
Right.
and has ignited or given the airspace necessary for that flame of anti-Semitism, which I believe is enduring, to light again. And in the context of saying never again, within the lifespan of the Holocaust, less than 25 years from Elie Wiesel's speech about indifference, we got American college kids at Columbia occupying buildings, declaring intifada,
Yeah.
celebrating Hamas.
Yeah. And the question, I think, Steve, part of it is, what's the end game? Are these schools going to divest of their investments? Why? And it won't influence Israel even if they do. What is it that you want? We've let this stuff go for so long where, the protests in people's driveways, right? Of like an elected official or in front of somebody's house. And it's protected speech, blah, 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 blah. Honestly, it's ridiculous. These things should have been policed a long time ago. I think it's totally wrong. We had it here in my neighborhood at my neighbor's house. He was an elected official. These people would march in his driveway about housing or something, and they tell his wife she was a fat pig, right? And then, you read an editorial in the newspaper saying, that's fine. Okay, great. Is that the way that so once you start saying, okay, that's great, you could be in the person's driveway yelling at them. Why can't you be on the campus yelling at everybody? Why can't you? I mean, this is the way it goes. And so now you have this situation where we've just let some things go. And listen, if your argument to me is Netanyahu's done a terrible job on the Palestinian territories, he really didn't want there to be 2 states, all along. And so, okay, great. I agree with you, Rob. That's true, right? So I sympathize. But if your argument is that there should be no Israel, that's not an argument that I sympathize with. That is a ridiculous argument. So, and I think in the news coverage of it, a lot of this just gets lost, right? It's, these people are all out there and they're protesting and, isn't this amazing? And it's not amazing. A lot of it is not amazing. I appreciate the passion, but some of it is really wrong.
Do you feel like you have a handle when you're watching the news about what's happening anywhere on these campuses?
Yeah, peaceful protest is great. I will tell you that I myself went up to Columbia the other day, Steve, because I don't like to take everybody's word for everything. And I walked, by the way, I recommend it all the way
I know you would do this.
To the end, and I went right up to the door and they said, you have to have a campus ID. And so I did try to sneak in. So I went around the side. There's a security guard every entrance. There was one guy who was sleeping. And he was old and he was sleeping. And I was like, I could just run past this guy and get it. But there were a lot of police and a lot of reporters outside of the campus. So I said, okay, I'm going to let this one go. So I didn't go in. I could see a little bit, but I'm also near UCLA. I will go over to UCLA at some point because I don't like to take everybody's word for everything. And I want to see what's going on. I want to be able to talk to people myself and find out really what's going on. The news reporting isn't great. I do like Catherine Rossman in the New York Times, but the reporting is not great on this issue. When I watch on television, Steve, I've had my own issues with some of these cable news networks and whether they're reporting the truth. And so I have a very hard time sometimes with these cable news networks.
Do you have a handle on what happened at UCLA?
I don't. Because a week ago they were saying, oh, UCLA is not as bad as USC, right? And then all of a sudden the UCLA thing turned around on a dime. There was a whole thing about how the UC schools, the University of California schools, are not having the same issue as all these private institutions. And then all of a sudden it turned. So I really don't know, aside from the news coverage of things that have happened the last couple of nights. But I'll go over there myself. My dentist is there, literally. So I will go over there and see what I can see.
And if you could wave a magic wand, in the Oval Office, right? What does the president need to do here, right? Does he need to lean back? Does he need to lean forward? Is he proximate to the proverbial cup on the green with regard to what he said yesterday?
Well, let me say this. I don't know that I have the answer, but I do have an answer on something else, which is somebody called me recently. I run this big group of entertainment industry leaders. That's a voluntary group. And one of the people in the group called me recently. I never talked to her one-on-one. And she's a well-known person in the entertainment industry. And she said she's on the other side. She doesn't agree with me on the Israel stuff, right? And she said, listen, I had this friend who, worked and quit working at the State Department, and the president's doing this absolutely terrible, terrible job. And we've got to go talk to him and tell him that, he shouldn't be supporting Israel. And she goes, this whole thing. And I said, first of all, we don't share the same point of view. But second of all, if I could get you in there to have that conversation, I would. It's great for people to hear different points of view. My point of view isn't always right. The president is not going to want to hear from you on this issue. He's been doing this for several decades. You're not telling him anything that he doesn't know. This is how he feels about the issue. He is pro-Israel. He obviously does not like Netanyahu. That's not a secret. Netanyahu doesn't like him.
When you talk to this person, her point of view, and you say that, what is her point of view? What would she like to see happen?
The point of view that she had was that Netanyahu, I swear, wants to take over Gaza for Israel and have Israel control Gaza forever. And that's really been the whole modus operandi all along. But what I want to say to people is, and I do say this to people, is the president's been doing this since the 1970s. He has relationships with everybody all over the world. He may not agree with you, but this is how he feels. None of us are going to change his mind on that, whether you're more pro-Israel than he is, whether you're more pro-Palestinian than he is. He obviously wants a two-state solution. He has been a friend of Israel for a long time, and he's going to continue to be. That's the truth. So, in terms of the college campus stuff, Steve, that you brought up, and how should the president handle it? The president is a pretty moderate guy, right? I'm sure he is great with people protesting. The same thing that you said. But the idea that people are going to be supporting the Intifada or against Israel's existence, that stuff's not happening. And the president is an adult. By the way, thank God. Because if it wasn't this president in the White House right now, and we end up with Donald Trump while these college protests are going on, it could be a very bad scene. And I know sometimes people prefer law and order to a certain extent, but it's also chaos, right? And if you end up with a Donald Trump and college campus protests and his control over some of these groups that he seems to think that he's going to have, it's going to end up very ugly.
I am, by word and deed, I think, pretty committed to keeping Donald Trump out of power, out of office, but I am worried about his return. And so people ask me all the time, do I think Biden will win? Been out of the country, a lot of people ask me, and what I say to them is always the same thing. I say my heart tells me that President Biden will win. My head tells me something else. So I look at the world right now, and I look at the war in Gaza, and I think Israel's losing the war. I think that Biden's losing the election. If it were tomorrow, Trump would be the president, but it's 187 days away, so a lot of time on the clock. And I look at the trials. I evaluate these trials in their aggregate now as a disaster. If Trump does win, history will be very, very brutally unkind to these trials and to the discretion of the prosecutors and a lot of their conduct, I suspect. But how do you see that?
I tell people in our entertainment group, Stephen, outside of it, the same thing, which is where everybody has anxiety about this election, right? The stakes are enormous in this election. The best thing that you could do is do something. Don't sit at home and watch the news all day. Don't focus on your Twitter feed. Do something. If you do something, you'll feel like you have some sense of control. So I know you're in the arena all the time, right? You've worked on many of these things and you know. So what I say to people is, what matters here? What matters here is not California. What matters is not New York. What matters are Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then from there, Arizona, Nevada, you know what the swing states are. Do something. Get people out to vote. Give money. Knock on doors. Michigan has early in-person voting, Steve, for the first time this year, where it starts, I think, like October 26th. Go drive people to the polls because every vote is going to matter in those states. Do that thing. Do something. But if you sit here and just watch TV, you may never get up from your couch. You may be so scared. I am more optimistic now than I was, let's say, 6 months ago. I feel that, the Biden campaign is super well organized. They're getting people out into the states. We seem to do better as Democrats in every election lately. It doesn't mean we will in 24, but the polling seems to show us not doing as well, and then we do better. Tom Suozzi in Long Island, for example, was a recent example of that. And so I feel good about the Democratic Party's ground game and what we're able to do in these swing states. But I would say to people, if you have anxiety, go do something. Really, do anything. Make phone calls. That will be helpful to you and your own mental health.
When we sit around and BS and talk about this stuff, I think about, I have this collection in a box, somewhere in storage now, right? Of all these old Time magazines and Life magazines. We go back to the 1930s, and I have some of them at the house, and I love looking at them, like opening up a time capsule. And you look at this era where there's so much crisis in journalism, such a collapse of trust between the American people and the media. And Time magazine, which I think has become rather celebrified and fatuous, all of a sudden, like kaboom, right? Time magazine is back, right? A cover for the ages, for whatever reason, right? There was no prohibitions that prevented anybody else from writing it, but finally, at long last, an American journalist goes and has a conversation with Donald Trump about what the plans are. And we find out he's going to deploy the military. We're going to have mass deportation camps that in most countries would be called concentration camps, filled with millions of people that will be shipped out of the country. We'll have 100,000 soldiers plus in America's cities, and tanks and armored personnel carriers. The government will be able to monitor women's pregnancies. I was on Scripps News last night, and the question they asked was, well, what do you think they mean by monitor women's pregnancies? And I said, well, good question. But I suppose what that means is this, that, and tell me if you disagree with this, if you interpret this the same way, or I'm full of shit, right? But what I think it means is that all pregnant women are potential suspects for the crime of abortion, which has to be evaluated if there's a loss of that pregnancy at any point during it, that there's always the possibility in the woman's heart of a malign intent towards her unborn child. Thus, we have to monitor all the way through. And I really don't understand intellectually, once you get there, why you're not then monitoring the birth control, right? And other things as well. But he's for that. He's locking up political opponents and prisoners, and the list goes on. But
Are you going to get locked up, Steve?
it's incredible to be asked the question, right? It's incredible to be asked the question. I'll tell you this. Well, it's incredible to be asked the question. It's incredible to be, to consider the question, but you can't be intimidated by it, right? At all. But what I think is amazing is when you get the question, which is basically a version of, well, what do you think he means by that? I think my answer is, I suppose he means he wants to open up concentration camps. And what's the what can you explain that?
You
Do you
also,
have,
by the way,
9 years into this, any kind of take on the, what I would say is what do you think he means by that?
well, I would say, when you talk about groups that he's being very clear at this point. In other words, if Donald Trump becomes president in 2016, famously the night of the election, they never thought they were going to win until the results came, right? They weren't planning a presidency. Everyone was planning to send out their resumes, and they already were, for their next jobs. They've been planning this one for years, so they're ready to go. And when we talk about who might get locked up, and we talk about a woman who's had a miscarriage, for example, but also the doctor, right? When we talk about journalists would get locked up in this circumstance, and they will make this happen. I have no doubt about it. They believe that they are going to have the Justice Department on their side. They're going to be changing a lot of the laws in this country. We've even talked about, not today, but the Comstock Act, which would allow for birth control to be sold through the mail. You will not be able to get birth control. Like, they are very clear. The Heritage Foundation is a right-wing organization that's made very clear how they want the government to work in a Trump presidency. And the other thing is that people need to remember that if Donald Trump is out of his term ends, somebody said to me the other day, we were talking about 2028 presidential candidates, Steve. That's how far down the road we were. And we're talking about all these great people like Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore. And they said to me, well, what's the difference about 2028? There's not going to be a democracy in 2028. So what would be the difference? In other words, if Donald Trump becomes president next year, do you think he's leaving office? Because he'll have committed 400 more crimes and would be prosecuted again the minute he left office. You think that he's leaving office in 2029? Of course he's not, right? So, do we want a king in this country? And I think people need to really think about that. One more, Steve. I'm just going to say one more quick thing. When George Washington led those troops across the Delaware, right? They were going to fight those German soldiers across the Delaware. They weren't talking about climate change. They weren't talking about the minimum wage. It was beating that king and that government and having self-government and having a democracy in the United States. We don't have to go cross the Delaware in the middle of the night in the freezing cold with snipers on the other side. We have to get on Zoom, go knock on doors, go give some money. And that's how we're going to save democracy in just the same way.
And if we were going to have a king, why the fuck would we pick Donald Trump? Which seems like a perfect place to leave it.
All right, Steve. Good
Matt
to talk
Littman.
to you, buddy.
Good talking to you.
Talk to you soon.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.